September 13, 1986. The late summer heat hangs heavy over Eugene, Oregon, the kind of heat that makes the asphalt shimmer and the air feel thick enough to breathe. At the rental car lot near the airport, most of the vehicles sit untouched in neat rows, their windshields reflecting the bright afternoon sun. Clipboard in hand, he walks past car after car, checking license plates and noting which vehicles have been sitting too long. Most of the time, the worst thing he finds is a forgotten soda cup or an old fast food wrapper left behind by a careless traveler. But that afternoon, something feels different. One white sedan stands out immediately. The suspension looks wrong, as if the car is sagging under unexpected weight, and as he steps closer, a faint smell drifts through the warm air. At first, he assumes it's just something spoiled inside the vehicle. Maybe groceries, maybe garbage left behind. But the closer he gets, the stronger the odor becomes. Sweet, rotting, unmistakably wrong. Trying to ignore the growing unease in his stomach, he reaches for the trunk. And inside lies the body of a man who has been dead for more than a day. Police quickly identify him as 31-year-old Peter Hutchins, a suspected narcotics dealer who had recently returned to Oregon from Hawaii. But as investigators dig deeper, they begin to realize something unsettling. Hutchins' murder isn't the only dark mystery connected to this region. Years earlier, a young woman had vanished after leaving work in Eugene. And more than a decade before that, a shallow grave discovered on a remote Oregon island held the remains of a teenage girl who would remain nameless for over 50 years. 3 cases, 3 victims, decades apart. And even today, each one leaves investigators with the same haunting question: what really happened? Sauvie Island, Oregon. February 23, 1970. Winter still lingered across the northern edge of the island. The land there was quiet and isolated, wide stretches of muddy riverbanks, tangled brush and patches of damp earth left behind by the Columbia River. It wasn't the kind of place many people visited unless they had a reason. That Monday afternoon, a Boy Scout troop leader was hiking through the area, leading a routine outdoor activity with several boys. The group moved carefully through the wet terrain, their boots sinking slightly into the cold mud as they explored the quiet wilderness. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But then something caught the troop leader's eye. Just off the narrow path, a small patch of earth looked different. The soil appeared freshly disturbed, darker and looser than the ground around it. In a place where the winter ground was usually hard and compact, this patch looked as if someone had dug into it not too long ago. Curious and slightly uneasy, he knelt down to take a closer look. Using a stick, he brushed away some of the soil. What he uncovered immediately sent a chill through him. Beneath the dirt were fragments of dark-colored clothing, what appeared to be a black, curly wig. Realizing something was terribly wrong, the troop leader quickly contacted authorities. Soon, investigators from Columbia County arrived at the remote site. As they carefully excavated the shallow grave, the grim truth slowly became clear. But the body had been there for a long time, so long, in fact, that the remains were completely skeletonized. There were no identifying documents, no jewelry, no purse, no personal belongings that might tell investigators who this person had once been. All they had were bones, and a few unsettling clues. Forensic experts examined the remains and made their first assessment. The victim appeared to be a young African-American female, likely a teenager or young adult. Evidence on the bones suggested trauma consistent with violence. But beyond that, there was almost nothing to work with. No missing persons report immediately matched the description. No witnesses came forward, and no suspects emerged. The investigation slowly stalled, leaving the girl in the shallow grave without even the most basic dignity of identification. Instead of a name, she was given a number. Case file 71-8880-R. For years, that number was the only way investigators could refer to her. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles south in Portland, another mystery had quietly unfolded years earlier. A teenage girl named Sandra Young had stopped attending Grant High School sometime in late 1968 or early 1969. Friends and classmates gradually noticed she was gone, but in an era before modern tracking systems or national databases, missing teenagers sometimes disappeared without much official attention. At the time, no one suspected that her disappearance might be connected to the unidentified skeleton buried on Sauvie Island. The two cases existed separately, like pieces of a puzzle no one realized belonged together. As the years passed, the investigation into the unidentified remains slowly faded. Evidence was archived, reports were filed away, and eventually the bones themselves were placed in storage. For 34 years, the girl from Sauvie Island remained nameless. Then, in 2004, something changed. Cold case investigators decided to reopen the file. The skeletal remains were transferred to the Oregon State Medical Examiner's office in Clackamas County. Advances in forensic science had begun transforming cold cases across the country, and detectives hoped that modern technology might finally succeed where earlier investigations had failed. A bone sample was carefully collected and sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. Scientists extracted DNA from the remains and developed a genetic profile. That profile was uploaded into CODIS, the national DNA database used by law enforcement agencies across the United States. Investigators waited. If the victim had family members already in the system, a match could finally reveal her identity. But when the results came back, there was nothing. No matches, no relatives, no answers. Years passed again. Then, in 2018, investigators were given another opportunity. Oregon State Police received a federal grant to explore a relatively new forensic method known as DNA phenotyping, a technique capable of predicting a person's physical appearance based on genetic markers. The case was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in advanced forensic genealogy. For 3 years, scientists studied the genetic data. Finally, in 2021, they produced something investigators had never had before: a face. Using the DNA, the lab generated a digital rendering of what the young woman might have looked like in life. The image showed a young woman with brown eyes and dark brown skin, her ancestry indicating a mix of West African and Northern European heritage. For the first time in over 50 years, investigators could see the person behind the bones, but even with a face, they still didn't have a name. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In January 2023, a private citizen uploaded their DNA profile to the public genealogy database GEDmatch. Unlike CODIS, GEDmatch allows users to compare their DNA with distant relatives who may have also uploaded their genetic information. When genealogists ran the Sauvie Island DNA through the system, they didn't find an immediate match, but they did find something important: a distant relative. It wasn't enough to identify the victim directly, but it provided a starting point. A professional genealogist began tracing family lines using census records, birth certificates, and decades of archived documents. It was painstaking work reconstructing family trees across generations in order to find where the victim might fit. Slowly, piece by piece, the puzzle began to come together. By July 2023, the genealogist had narrowed the search to a specific branch of a family. One member of that family was contacted. During the conversation, the woman revealed something chilling: she had once had a sister who disappeared from Portland in the late 1960s. Her name was Sandra Young. Investigators requested a DNA sample from the family to confirm the connection. When the test results came back, the answer was undeniable. After more than half a century, the girl from Sauvie Island finally had her name back. She was Sandra Sandy Young, born June 25, 1951. For her surviving family members, the discovery was emotional and bittersweet. For decades, they had lived without knowing what happened to Sandra. Now they finally had an answer. But it wasn't the answer they had hoped for. The identification of Sandra Young marked a major forensic achievement, but it also raised an even more troubling question: the shallow grave, the black, curly wig, and the decades of silence. They were the only traces left behind by a killer who had managed to remain hidden for more than 50 years. Sandra's nephew, Laurel Gibbs, later reflected that learning her identity brought a sense of closure but not peace, because knowing her name was only the beginning. The person responsible for her death had never been found. And today, the case of Sandra Young remains open, an echo from the past that investigators are still trying to answer. Eugene, Oregon, August 20th, 1973. The workday was coming to an end at the Bon Marché department store in downtown Eugene. Inside the store, employees were finishing their shifts, straightening displays and preparing to head home after another busy summer day. Among them was 24-year-old Vicki Lynn Hollar. Vicki had only been living in Eugene for about 2 months, but she had already made a strong impression on the people around her. Friends described her as warm. She had recently graduated from Southern Illinois University and moved to Oregon in search of new opportunities and a fresh start. But what people remembered most about Vicki was her kindness. She had a habit of helping others whenever she could, even complete strangers. Sometimes, that meant something as simple as offering someone a ride. Around 6 p.m., evening shadows were beginning to stretch across the pavement as employees headed home. Vicki climbed into her car, a black Mite 965 Volkswagen Beetle that stood out for one unusual reason. The running boards had been removed from the sides, giving the small car a stripped-down, almost rugged appearance. It wasn't a detail most people would notice immediately, but it made the car distinctive enough that anyone familiar with it would recognize it. After saying goodbye, Vicki started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. Her apartment was less than 2 miles away. It should have taken only a few minutes to get home. That evening she was supposed to meet a friend around 8 p.m. for a small neighborhood party, but Vicki never arrived. At first, her absence didn't seem alarming. Friends assumed something had come up, or that she had simply decided not to attend. But as the hours passed, and then the next day, concerns slowly began to grow. 2 days later, her roommate reported her missing. When police entered Vicki's apartment, they immediately noticed something unsettling. Everything looked normal. Her clothes were still hanging neatly in the closet. Personal belongings sat exactly where they should have been, and her final paycheck from the Bon Marché department store still waited for her at work unclaimed. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that she had packed up and left. It was as if she had simply vanished somewhere between her workplace and her apartment. Investigators quickly began retracing her final known movements. The last confirmed sighting of Vicki was the moment she drove away from the employee parking lot. And then, nothing. But there was another mystery. Vicki hadn't disappeared alone. Her car was missing too. The 1965 Volkswagen Beetle had completely vanished along with her. Police circulated alerts across Oregon and neighboring states. The car was distinctive enough to be recognized, black, with the running boards removed and Illinois license plates Grendy 738. Yet despite the alerts, weeks passed with no sightings. No abandoned vehicle, no reports of the car being sold or dumped. Nothing. Months went by. Investigators began exploring different possibilities. One theory focused on something friends had mentioned about Vicki's personality, her willingness to help strangers. Vicki had occasionally picked up hitchhikers, a common practice in the early 1970s, especially among young people traveling along the West Coast. Detectives began to wonder if someone she had tried to help might have taken advantage of her kindness. Another possibility was even more troubling. What if someone had forced her off the road, or convinced her to pull over? Without a crime scene, detectives were left chasing shadows. As the investigation stalled, the case slowly faded from headlines. If someone had killed Vicki, what had happened to the Volkswagen? One officer later remarked that it was as if both Vicki and the car had simply been swallowed whole. Some detectives speculated that the vehicle may have been driven into a deep reservoir, or perhaps pushed off a remote logging road somewhere in the dense forests surrounding Eugene. The Pacific Northwest was full of isolated places where a car could disappear forever. Years passed, then decades. And still, neither Vicki nor her Volkswagen Beetle was ever found. But in January 1989, a shocking development would cast a new shadow over the case. Across the country, one of the most notorious serial killers in American history was facing execution. In the final days before his death, he began confessing to murders investigators had never known about. The killer was Ted Bundy. Bundy admitted to multiple killings across several states, including Washington, Utah, Colorado, and Oregon. During those final confessions, he hinted that his killing spree had actually begun earlier than investigators had originally believed, possibly as early as 1972. That timeline caught the attention of detectives in Eugene, because Vicki Lynn Hollar had disappeared in August of 1973. When investigators reviewed the details, the similarities were difficult to ignore. At the time of Vicki's disappearance, Bundy had been traveling through the Interstate 5 corridor, which runs directly through Eugene, and Vicki matched the profile of many of his known victims. She was young, attractive, with long, dark brown hair parted in the middle, a feature Bundy was known to favor in many of the women he targeted. There was also another disturbing possibility. Bundy was known for using deception to approach victims, sometimes pretending to need help or asking women for assistance before attacking. If Vicki had encountered someone like that, someone asking for help, her compassionate nature might have led her to stop. Unfortunately, investigators were never able to question Bundy specifically about Vicki's disappearance before his execution, and without physical evidence tying him directly to the case, the theory remains just that, a theory. Today, more than 50 years later, the disappearance of Vicki Lynn Hollar remains one of Eugene's most haunting mysteries. The black Volkswagen Beetle has never been recovered, and the young woman who left work on a warm August evening in 1973 has never been seen again. Somewhere out there, the truth still exists. But like so many cold cases, it remains hidden, waiting for the one piece of evidence that might finally bring Vicki's story to an end. Eugene, Oregon. September 13, 1986. The late summer heat still lingered across the runway at Eugene Airport, radiating off the pavement in shimmering waves. Just beyond the main terminal sat a quiet rental car lot, rows of vehicles parked neatly under the afternoon sun. For one employee working that day, the routine was simple. Walk the lot, check the vehicles, note which ones had been returned, which ones were overdue, and which ones had been sitting too long. Most days were uneventful, but that afternoon, something immediately felt wrong. One car, a white sedan, looked out of place. From a distance, the employee noticed the vehicle's rear suspension sagging lower than it should have been, as if something heavy had been placed inside the trunk. Then there was the smell, but as he walked closer, the odor became impossible to ignore. Sweet, rotting, the kind of smell that instantly makes your stomach tighten. Hesitating, the employee circled the vehicle, trying to figure out what might be causing it. Eventually, he reached for the trunk. The metal latch clicked open, and inside, he found the body of a man. Police quickly arrived at the scene, sealing off the area as investigators examined the grisly discovery. The victim was soon identified as 31-year-old Peter Hutchins. But the deeper detectives looked into his life, the clearer it became that Hutchins had been living in a dangerous world. Just 5 days earlier, he had returned from Hawaii. According to investigators, Hutchins had been involved in negotiating large-scale drug deals involving cocaine and marijuana. He was believed to be a high-level narcotics dealer operating in Oregon during the height of the 1980s drug trade. And in that world, money and betrayal could turn deadly very quickly. Detectives began retracing Hutchins' final days. His last known movements suggested he had been traveling around Eugene attempting to collect money from someone who owed him a significant debt. Somewhere during those efforts, something had gone terribly wrong. Forensic examination determined Hutchins had been shot, and that his body had likely been placed inside the rental car trunk more than 24 hours before it was discovered. But investigators faced an immediate problem. They didn't know where the murder had actually happened. The rental car lot wasn't the crime scene, it was simply where the body had been abandoned. Detectives began executing search warrants across Eugene, hoping to uncover evidence or witnesses who might have seen something suspicious. Some searches even stretched as far as Bend, Oregon, where investigators believed Hutchins may have had connections. But every lead seemed to hit the same obstacle. Silence. Many of the people who knew Hutchins were themselves involved in the same underground narcotics world. And in that world, talking to police was considered a betrayal. One detective later summed it up bluntly: drug dealers don't like talking to cops. But without witnesses willing to cooperate, none of those names could be tied directly to the crime. Even Hutchins' own family remained distant from the investigation. His wife, Barbara Hutchins, declined to speak with detectives and instead referred all inquiries to her attorney. With few answers and no clear suspects, the investigation slowly began to stall. Over the years, the file on Peter Hutchins grew thicker, filled with notes, interviews, and theories that never quite led to a breakthrough. Eventually, the case became part of the Eugene Police Department's Cold Case Unit, where investigators continued to revisit the evidence, hoping that new information might someday surface. But even today, one crucial detail remains unknown. Where was Peter Hutchins actually killed? Somewhere, at some point that night, there had been another person present, someone who saw what happened, someone who knows exactly how the deal went wrong, and someone who knows who pulled the trigger. Today, Crime Stoppers of Oregon continues to offer a $500 reward for any information that could finally solve the case. Because until that day comes, the file on Peter Hutchins remains open. Just like the other mysteries that haunt this region. A teenage girl buried for decades on a remote Oregon island. A young woman who vanished on her short drive home from work. And a narcotics dealer left inside the trunk of an abandoned car. 3 victims, 3 separate cases. Somewhere out there, the truth still exists. The only question is, will anyone ever reveal it?